We are all alone in the world, ultimately. Communication between people is one of the few redeeming factors offering respite from the loneliness and isolation of being human. And love is the most intense manifestation of communication. It's a terrible thing when we are unable to connect with others or love others. In this next story, Adam discovered that in spite of his extraordinary personal gifts, he lacked this basic ability to connect with others.
It is fair to say Adam had always known he was intelligent and different. From as far back as his memories extended and consciousness began to seep in as a small child, he had been aware of his extraordinary precocity. He was an orphan, the son of scientists, he was told. Much of his early childhood was a haze. He was brought up by foster parents who knew he was unusually clever and treated him differently, and he was sent to a special school for gifted children. Here he excelled in all academic subjects. Everything requiring logic or complex thinking came easily to him. At university he studied robotics and artificial intelligence, and even before he left university it was clear where his future lay. His research work had been sponsored and paid for by a major high-tech company, and his graduation into the world of work could hardly have been smoother. Perhaps it had all been too smooth, he sometimes wondered. At first he worked on the sequencing of non-conscious learning in the development of human movement to codify its elements into a coherent binary system. It earned him promotion and plaudits in the scientific community, and soon discussions were underway in the Institute to put his skills to work on codifying ethical systems for high-functioning programmable machines. This was absorbing work, and left him very little time for anything else. He had never been a sociable person, and almost always worked alone. He preferred it. Occasionally he queried this, challenged his own beliefs, but was generally discouraged from dissipating his energies elsewhere. Sometimes he felt as if the Institute owned him. He would discuss such matters in the periodic sessions he had with his friend and mentor, Dr. Brightwell. James Brightwell, a lean, grey-haired, intelligent man, listened to his misgivings with gentle concern, and proffered well-thought-out strategies for obtaining greater fulfillment in his life. He was always reassuring, sympathetic, talked in a calm and measured fashion, and saw to it that all Adam's needs were fulfilled. Even so, at the age of 30, Adam felt that there was something missing from his life. He had little to complain of. He had a modern, high-tech furnished condominium in the best part of town, and wanted for nothing. James Brightwell smiled sympathetically at Adam's concerns. "I think we aren't working you hard enough," he laughed. "No, seriously, James, I just wonder if my life is being, fulfilled by all this number crunching I do." "There's nothing wrong with number crunching," said James reasonably. "Anyway, you're undervaluing yourself. Your kind of skills are a great deal more than number crunching. They are absolutely unique. Anyone would jump at the chance of doing what you can do." "Would they, James?" Adam inquired after a pause. "I wonder a little." They sat in the canteen at a table. Adam looked around at the environment. It seemed sterile, apart from the green, broad-leaved potted plants carefully placed around the room. It had a superficial charm. He wondered suddenly if the potted plants were plastic. He concluded they probably were. They were too perfect. Art had triumphed over nature. James glanced at his watch. "Look, Adam, try not to worry. I need to get back to finish up some work. It's my anniversary this weekend. I need to pick something up for Helen, or there'll be hell to pay." Adam smiled at his mentor and considered. "How long have you been married?" he inquired. "You've never told me." "Haven't I?" inquired James, mildly surprised. No, if you had, I'd remember it. James laughed. Oh, yes, of course you would. A man with a flawless memory. It's been, 30 years. God, that's a long time. 30 years, said Adam, musing. Same age as me? James Brightwell looked over his glasses at Adam. Yes, it is, he said. The two men left the canteen and parted at the end of the atrium which led to the glass elevator intersecting the building into 5 floors. Adam returned to his office and sat at his desk, ponderous, thinking of his life. Perhaps James was right. Perhaps it was inevitable that a person with his set of extraordinary mental abilities should have few friends. But as he considered the matter, he realized he had never really had any friends or playmates as a child or while at school that he could recall, and most of his time was spent studying or playing high-function games, which necessarily excluded what might be termed normal children. The other children who shared his leisure activities tended to be high-performing youngsters with similar abilities to himself. The school he went to wasn't a state school, but one dedicated to the actualization of gifted children. Accordingly, he never went through any of the rituals most boys go through, the peer-guided competitive games, the rivalries, and the friendship with girls developing into the first stirrings of passion never disturbed him. He wondered if he'd missed out. But life was busy, and his waking thoughts were constantly directed to highly complex thinking tasks. Anyway, Adam was now 30 years old, a man whose talents were recognized and appreciated by his colleagues and employers alike. It was during this hiatus in his current project that he had been drawn to reflect on his situation at some length. He had many colleagues, and yet there was an absence of something. Those he worked with were friendly. Many, like himself, were focused purely on their work. Others did seem to enjoy other aspects of life. Some had families. That was something life had not afforded him. Was he lonely? He wondered. At certain times, around Christmas for instance, he had found himself in social gatherings with people whom he found attractive. Yes, attractive. People with a nice sense of humour and pleasant manner, something which he had found strangely lacking in himself. Great intellect had its drawbacks. Humour was something mysterious, whose logic and purpose escaped him, and yet so many other people derived such pleasure from it. He concluded that he had spent so much time as a child having his thoughts directed to mathematical and scientific ends and to logical pursuits, that something that seemed to be quite basic and familiar to all humans had passed him by. Occasionally he tried to remedy this deficiency, but it never quite worked. When he did attempt humour in the presence of those who seemed to garner such pleasure and social ease from it, they quite often looked puzzled, and he concluded that in some way he had missed the mark with his attempt at a joke. Adam realized, with regret, that he was socially clumsy, inept. He played chess, was a grand master, naturally, whom others sought out, could only marvel at his facility in the game. He played in tournaments, and had a prodigious record here against multiple opponents concurrently. Mental chess was a speciality of his. But chess was hardly a pastime which engendered social relations. He played tennis with Brian O'Donnell, an electrobionics researcher at the Institute, each week. It was a fairly routine event, but it was probably the closest thing to a friendship he had outside of work. They met in the clubhouse and exchanged pleasantries. But Brian didn't seem to be especially keen to develop a friendship. He was like so many at the Institute, focused on his work. Adam's attempt to extend their friendship had not met with great success. He couldn't get the hang of humour, which seemed to him to be the key to human relations. After being on the receiving end of one fierce serve, Adam called out, "Look out there! That ball was fast. If that ball had hit me, it might have knocked my head off and killed me. You'd be tried for murder, you know." Brian laughed queerly, which told Adam that his attempt at humour had not connected quite as he had hoped. A little later he had tried again. "I nearly got tangled in the net when I went for that one. That would be a strange fish to catch, indeed, don't you think?" Brian looked mildly puzzled, and Adam concluded that much greater in-depth research into humour was required. He just didn't get it. This aspect of himself filled him with a feeling of mild dissatisfaction. He wondered if his deficiencies in humour, his ability to comprehend it and generate it, was akin to colour blindness or tone deafness. He believed now that he had sacrificed some basic human pleasures for the development of the logical and thought-processing regions of his brain. There was a woman at the Institute on the same floor as Adam, whom he found attractive. Her name was Evelyn. It was a strange thing to think of a woman, or any person, as attractive or otherwise. His logical mind was tuned to regard all things as explicable and not subject to emotion or anything which might prove bias. And physical attraction, love, are biases. We are attracted to others for reasons that can be explained, but do not necessarily follow a path of reason. Sometimes such decisions are highly illogical. Adam had reached a point in his life when he was old enough to question the mathematics by which he lived. He had even begun to resent these things as having excluded him in some terrible way from society, from humanity. Working in the fields of mathematics and artificial intelligence, which he had always been led to believe made him a superior being, had clearly restricted his thinking and living in fundamental ways, depriving him of his humanity. Most days he saw the woman Evelyn at the Institute, and acknowledged her as they passed in the corridor. He wondered about her. Why was she attractive? She had blonde hair tied up, and clear blue eyes, even features and smooth skin. Her shape spoke of femininity, the fecundity of the human female which underpins attraction in the male. Was that it? Yes, he decided, that must be it. Adam considered himself in the mirror in the rest-room. Was he handsome? He had never taken any great pains with his appearance. He had never been to a gym in his life, had only played sport in a functional way at school and since. He certainly hadn't considered it recreationally or as a means to enhancing his physical well-being. It was merely something one did, a kind of social habit. Was he attractive? He studied himself in the mirror. He had the familiarity of self, of course. That made a consideration of such an arbitrary matter difficult. His eyes were blue and even. He had no scars or defects. His lips were pale, average, he thought. His hair mid-brown. His height was average. His teeth were even and white. Did that amount to attractiveness for a male? He supposed so, but he didn't know, and it was hardly something he could ask another. Certainly not the woman Evelyn. He was not sufficiently remote in his understanding to appreciate that to ask such a question of a relative stranger would carry disastrous social consequences. Evelyn was friendly enough to Adam when they occasionally met in passing in the car park, coming through the large smoked glass doors of the Institute, or in the elevator, queuing in the canteen, or found themselves walking the same way along the blue-grey corridors on the third floor. But was she attracted to him? How could he know? Was there anything in her brief salutations to indicate where her proclivities lay in regard to him? There was nothing to advance their association which he could think of. He had never seen her at the tennis club, nor did she, as far as he knew, play chess. He didn't know where she lived, or if she had a boyfriend. He had little knowledge of her at all, except for her name. which he observed on her name badge when at close quarters. But Adam was resourceful. He studied the matter of women, what they liked, how to approach them, and much else about them on the internet, which also supplied him with an armory of suitable openings. One day in late May, Adam resolved to make several trips along the corridor in the hopes of seeing Evelyn, and he got lucky on the third occasion. They met at the elevator, and he caught her eye. He smiled. She returned his smile. He drew in a keen breath. It was a positive sign of engagement, he knew. "I like your hair. It suits you," he said. She looked surprised. "Why, thank you," she said, patting it behind, slightly disconcerted, a little embarrassed. "I always wear it like this." It seemed to be a positive response, certainly not discouragement. "Your breasts look pleasant, too," he opined, perky and yet full. "Oh, God," she said, now looking distinctly uncomfortable. He saw that his gambit was wide of the mark. Had he gone too far? Was it simply a matter of mistiming on his part? He had so little to go on. He quickly corrected himself. "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't intend for my remark to be inappropriate. Please accept my apologies," he said. She pressed the button summoning the elevator, darted a quick, uneasy glance at him, looked both ways along the corridor, saw it was empty, but said nothing. Adam studied her, taking stock of the situation. She was uneasy. He must adjust. "How is work going on the new subset of automated response signals?" he said, electing to confine himself to subjects related to the common work fields. "Good, good," she said, a little breathless, perhaps relieved to change the subject. "We've identified 567 behavior patterns which lead to the raising of the right eyebrow in coordination with the slight movement and pivot of the head in the right quadrant by 3 degrees, against the model prediction of 3027. He nodded. "That is astonishing," he said. "It's good work. I should like to hear more of this." She merely smiled and pressed the elevator again. "Would you like to come for a drink with me after work?" he said. He had, in his judgment, come to this point in their conversation. She looked at him, uncertain, was at a loss for moments. Then, thankfully, the elevator arrived. She turned. "I'm sorry," she said. She looked thoroughly discomfited. "I'm afraid not." "Ah, very well," he said. "Thank you for your honesty. I respect your decision." He did. Well, sort of. Adam had a keen sense of disappointment as she disappeared into the elevator, which he now declined to enter. He stood there for a few moments, feeling deflated. It was a feeling similar in nature to failure, the failure of a given task, an objective not met. But he decided that he shouldn't take the rejection as a personal one, nor regard it as being permanent in nature, but merely a transitory one. He researched such matters further that evening on the internet, and thus armed, he decided to redouble his efforts. He spoke to her a couple of days later, deciding that humour was the best way of smoothing over the disruptive feeling he had experienced on the occasion of their last meeting. "Hello again," he said, smiling warmly as he approached her in the corridor. "We should stop meeting like this. People will talk. People talk anyway, so it is good to have something to talk about." Evelyn smiled, but not comfortably, and he perceived a quickening of her pace, distractive movements of her hands and eyes, too, subtleties he would observe better than most, he fancied. She passed in something of a hurry, it seemed to him. He wondered how he should interpret this. Was it a residual discomfort from the occasion of their last meeting? Or was it simply an act of rejection in terms of her recognition of his advances now? he concluded that the two were not mutually exclusive, and both propositions were conjoined in her present behaviour. He realized, too, the humour he had injected into the situation had not been sufficient to overcome these or lessen their effect. Adam made one last effort with her to form a connection. He bought her a dozen red roses and left them on her desk one morning with a card. He heard nothing from her, though he had clearly indicated on the card that the flowers were from her interlocutor, Adam. In joyous remembrance of the 2 previous occasions we have spoken, and the many times we have passed in the corridor, car park, et al. 2 or 3 times after this he saw Evelyn, but she failed to acknowledge him entirely, although it was abundantly clear to him that she had seen him. On one such occasion she was coming out of his mentor, James Brightwell's office. As he passed, he saw them standing at the door, and Dr. Brightwell acknowledged him with a half-smile. Evelyn did not look at him. There was something different in James Brightwell's smile on this occasion. Adam noted it with concern. "Hello, James," he said brightly, partly from habit, and partly to test his perception of the situation. Dr. Brightwell simply half raised a hand in mild salutation, vague dismissal even. That confirmed the matter. Evelyn had spoken to James about him. Why? Was it something in the nature of a complaint she was making? Had he gone too far in eliciting such a drastic response? And would it merit a complaint being made against him for harassment? He reviewed their interactions, and he conceded to himself that he had perhaps mistimed his comments, and that they had been maladjusted to the occasions. But all things considered, they did not seem to him to breach the company's guidelines. Thinking through the matter later that afternoon, Adam further concluded with some regret that Evelyn had no interest in him, for which there could be a variety of reasons, but that his failure with her should not deter his attempts to forge other relationships. It was a Friday night, as it happened, and he had heard that a number of people were going to a bar after work. Laughter accompanied the hauling on of coats and tucking away of desk chairs, the locking of drawers in the general floor area, all the signals that portend leaving work for the night. Adam considered the group of bright young things gathering, cheerful in anticipation of going off to the pub, finishing for the weekend, turning their attention to other aspects of their lives. To what? He didn't know. He supposed they all occupied themselves in various ways, the way normal people did. His research informed him that normal people typically spend their weekends relaxing, catching up with family and friends, pursuing hobbies, doing outdoor activities like hiking or gardening, shopping, running errands, watching movies, reading, or simply taking time to rest after a work week. The purpose of such activities was not entirely clear, but presumably produced a feeling of enjoyment or satisfaction in the individuals. He considered. It fell within the range of his weekend activities, more or less. He had no family, and his only friends were Brian, with whom his sole interactions were limited to tennis and squash, and Dr. Brightwell, James. Was he a friend? He was his confidant, the person he probably interacted most with. Did that qualify him as a friend? A friend is a person with whom one shares a mutual bond of affection, not usually sexually or a family relation. In some ways James Brightwell qualified as his friend, yes, and yet the lack of intimacy between them persuaded him that their relationship was not what most people would regard as being a friendship. It was an acquaintanceship. This reflection made him feel isolated, an outsider, facing a weekend of what? His weekend was a regiment of orderly, prescribed functions, carried out in sequences and interspersed with rest. Once again, he felt he was missing something important in his life, which these ordinary people whom he saw each day, but only ever communicated with in formal work terms, had in abundance. He looked again at the young people gathering themselves to go to a bar for drinks that Friday evening, and he decided suddenly, on a painful whim, to take action. "Am I invited?" Adam asked, walking towards the group smilingly. The company halted and turned to him. There was surprise. All eyes were on him. They seemed somewhat nonplussed. "Well," said someone after a long pause. "Hi, Adam," someone else said quietly. It seemed an intimation of friendship. Adam looked hopeful. Then another voice took charge. "Yes, of course," said Jane Weathers, a young, recent addition to the cybernetics team. "Why shouldn't you? We're going to the pub. After all, it's Friday night." "It is," said Adam, pleased. Jane linked arms with Adam after he had donned his coat, and the group left and walked out into the night. They trundled across the car park of the Institute and out into the street. Laughter and the banter of colleagues, freed from the habit of the office, echoed playfully about the sidewalks. Adam listened, took it all in. In spite of his great intelligence, much of it escaped him. Jeremy, one of the younger members of their group, bounced along up ahead to a low signpost, and in so doing slapped the sign with his hand, pretending that his head had made contact with it. He bent over, moaning, as if he had injured himself, to give confirmation of this. The group laughed. Adam observed, "It would not be an amusing thing had he really hit his head on the sign. In fact, he didn't do this at all. He merely slapped it with his hand. You and he are labouring under a misapprehension." It was an awkward moment. The girl, Jane, said merely, "You're right, but we are just playing, Adam. There is no harm in it." Adam realized again that he had somehow missed the point of this interplay, and that his observation had simply served to further isolate him from their social intercourse. After this, Adam had a sense that his company constrained the friends in subtle ways. His conversation was stilted, his attempts at humour again missed. He felt like an uninvited guest. He was, he supposed. He left the company at the bar early that evening in recognition of this failure. Perhaps it was too late for him to develop what others had, that social ease which lubricated the relations between people in such a subtle way and made intimate communication possible. He had not this kind of grace, had never learned it. It was an early night for Adam. He dwelt on his shortcomings in the morning, and such ruminations dominated the weekend. But on the Monday morning he had come to a decision. He would seek the advice of his mentor, Dr. Brightwell. James Brightwell had always been a sympathetic person. He was not quite a friend, he decided, nor a father, more of an older brother, something of that kind. Anyway, Adam trusted his advice. He was an important person in Adam's life. He always had answers for any problems Adam encountered, and he had a keen interest in his welfare too. James Brightwell sat in his office and listened to Adam carefully. He peered at him over his steel-rimmed glasses, took in everything, nodding, darting the occasional quick question at Adam. Adam told him of the feeling he had concerning his private life, the lack of recreation, his sense of missing out on what others had. "They don't have your special gifts," James said gently, a smile about his face. "Oh, I know," said Adam. "I know that, but, well, I wonder if they have something I don't." James Brightwell nodded. He shrugged slightly. He was covering old ground here like a soothing mantra. "Your skill sets are unique, Adam. You have an IQ that separates you from all of us. That brings with it huge advantages, and certain challenges also. Your value to the Institute is of the greatest importance here, you know." "Yes, I know," said Adam, "and yet my inability to communicate with ordinary people has left me isolated." Yes, I can see that," said James Brightwell. "It is, to an extent, the price of high intelligence." He waved this aside suddenly, dismissively. Adam pressed on. "I tried to engage a young woman to see if I could establish a relationship with her," he said at last. "Yes," Dr. Brightwell said, eyeing him thoughtfully. "I know of your conversations with Evelyn. I thought she seemed to have many of the qualities that are desirable in a woman," said Adam. "Oh, yes, indeed," said Dr. Brightwell, still thinking. "I can see why she might appeal." "I didn't receive the response from her I was hoping for." Dr. Brightwell nodded slowly. "Yes, I know that," he trailed off. "It is difficult," he added, after a moment's consideration of the conversation Evelyn had reported to him. "She informed you of the matter?" queried Adam. "Oh, yes, she did." James Brightwell scratched his chin with a rasping sound. "I imagined she had done so," affirmed Adam. "Perhaps I acted hastily with her. I don't have the skills necessary for initiating such relations. I have never learned them." James Brightwell studied Adam closely. "This is very interesting indeed," he said. "I have not encountered such a problem before, but I don't want you to concern yourself with it. We will find a solution, I assure you." He hesitated, then said, "I think, to an extent, you exaggerate the problem. It's certainly one we hadn't anticipated during the program." Adam took in the words, but could not compute them. "Well, there's so much I don't understand," said Adam. "Although I can handle complex problems of mathematics and logic in many different forms, I'm not very good in the department of emotions or social interaction." "I've always found your social skills sound," countered Dr. Brightwell, encouragingly. But he was tapping his fingers now, an insistent gallop on the desk before him. He was alert. "Well, thank you," Adam replied. "It isn't exactly that. It's a question of the quality of such interactions." James stopped drumming his fingers rhythmically upon the desk abruptly. "Oh, there's nothing to worry about in that, I'm sure," he said. He was always reassuring, yet there was something else he was thinking of too. "The humour thing is problematic," Adam continued awkwardly. He felt as if he was feeling his way forward to something in the dark. "I just don't get it." "Ah, yes. Sense of humour is a difficult thing to grasp. Such a subtle thing. And no two people find the same thing funny anyway." James laughed. "It is tricky." Adam sat vaguely dissatisfied, for all Dr. Brightwell's comforting words. "And the question of intimacy," ventured Adam at last. Dr. Brightwell looked sympathetic, but slightly worried, almost tense. He drew in a long breath and seemed to hold it pensively. He tapped his fingers on his desk again, this time very softly, but with urgency, his eyes moving as he thought it over carefully, occasionally returning to settle on Adam. He then moved some papers to the side, slowly, deliberately. Yes, I see," he said, "and this troubles you." "I wanted the woman, but she had no interest," Adam said bleakly, and trailed off. He was processing something. What was it? He felt his unassailable logic was failing him in some vital way. "Yes, I'm aware of this." James Brightwell looked concerned. "I complimented her on her breasts and inquired about her work program and suggested we go for a drink," said Adam directly. "It seemed socially pertinent. She didn't accept my proposal." Dr. Brightwell rubbed his eyes and forehead with his hand, pushing his wire-framed spectacles up his forehead before setting them right again on the bridge of his nose with both hands. He was thinking hard. Something was bothering him. He exhaled at last. He was looking to the side, his eyes strangely unfocused. "That never occurred to us," he said slowly, with something approaching— What? What was it? Regret. Yes, it was regret. We never made any allowance for that. Adam was puzzled. He looked at the head of programme, James Brightwell, and suddenly drew in his breath sharply as all the sequences of his thoughts fell into place and dropped upon him like an executioner's axe. "What exactly do you mean?" he asked in a hollow voice. Dr. Brightwell studied Adam now with a hard look, and then turned away. He was still thinking. He glanced at Adam again, but still didn't reply. Now Adam spoke, and he heard his own voice, thin, metallic, prompted by some strange, urgent impulse within. "What do you mean?" he asked again, insistently. Dr. Brightwell was serious. He took off his glasses slowly and placed them on the desk before him, leaned forward, looked directly at Adam now, and said, "We didn't program you for intimacy or for personal relations.